spooky place.
Have you ever felt a chill run down your spine when you glanced at a mirror in the dark? Well, buckle up, because Maggie's story will make you question every reflection you see. And trust me, after this, you won't be sleeping well tonight. Before we begin, I request you to like the video and subscribe to the channel. On that note, let's begin. The girl in the mirror. Maggie had always been drawn to old things. Antique shops, weathered books, forgotten trinkets. So, when she moved into her new apartment and found an ornate, full-length mirror left behind by the previous tenant, she didn't think much of it. It was dusty, its frame chipped and worn, but it had a certain charm. She propped it up against the wall opposite her bed, thinking it would add character to the room. She didn't notice the faint, almost imperceptible crack running diagonally across the glass, nor the way the reflection seemed to shimmer if you stared at it too long. The first few nights were uneventful. The mirror sat there, silent and still, reflecting the dim light of her bedside lamp. But on the fourth night, something changed. Maggie woke abruptly, her heart pounding. The room was dark, the only light coming from the pale glow of the moon through her window. She felt an oppressive weight in the air, as though the room itself was holding its breath. Her eyes were drawn to the mirror. It was facing her bed. She didn't remember turning it that way. Maggie sat up, her throat dry. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination playing tricks in the dark. But then she saw it, a flicker of movement in the mirror, something that wasn't her. Her breath hitched. She squinted, leaning forward, her fingers gripping the edge of the blanket. The reflection was wrong. The room in the mirror was darker, the shadows deeper. And there, in the corner of the glass, something shifted. Her heart thudded in her chest as she swung her legs over the side of the bed. The floor was cold beneath her feet, but she barely noticed. She took a step forward, then another, her eyes locked on the mirror. The closer she got, the more she could see. The reflection wasn't hers. Not entirely. The figure in the glass was her, but distorted, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. It was as if someone had taken her image and warped it, stretching it into something unnatural. Maggie froze, her hand hovering inches from the glass. The reflection didn't mimic her. It just stood there, grinning, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. The air grew colder, and she could see her breath fogging in front of her. The reflection's grin widened, its teeth too sharp, too many, and then it moved. It lunged at the glass, its hands slamming against the surface with a sound like cracking ice. Maggie stumbled back, finally finding her voice. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the room. The reflection's hands pressed against the glass, and she realized with mounting horror that they weren't just pressing, they were pushing through. The surface of the mirror rippled like water, and cold, skeletal fingers emerged, grasping at the air. Maggie turned to run, but it was too late. The hand shot out, faster than she could react, and seized her wrists. The touch was freezing, like being grabbed by death itself. She struggled, thrashing against the grip, but the hands were impossibly strong. They pulled her forward, toward the mirror. She dug her heels into the floor, but it was no use. Her reflection's grin widened as she was dragged closer, the surface of the mirror now a swirling, inky void. "No," she screamed, but her voice was muffled, as if the room itself was conspiring against her. The hands yanked her forward, and she felt herself being pulled into the mirror. The world twisted, the room spinning around her. For a moment, she was suspended in darkness, the cold seeping into her bones. Then, with a sickening lurch, she was through. The room on the other side was a nightmare version of her own. The walls were cracked and oozing a dark, viscous liquid. The air was thick with the stench of decay. And the mirror, her mirror, was now a gaping hole, the edges jagged and pulsating like a wound. She turned, desperate to escape, but the reflection, her twisted doppelganger, was there, blocking her path. "Welcome home," it hissed, its voice a grotesque parody of her own. It reached out, its fingers elongating into claws, and Maggie realized with a sinking dread that this wasn't just a reflection. It was something else, something ancient and malevolent that had been waiting, biding its time. She backed away, but the room seemed to close in around her. The walls groaned, the floor shifting beneath her feet. The doppelganger advanced, its grin never faltering. Maggie's mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. The mirror was her only exit, and it was now a portal to this hellish place. As the doppelganger closed in, Maggie made a desperate decision. She turned and ran toward the mirror, diving through the swirling void. For a moment, she felt the cold hands grabbing at her again, pulling her back, but she fought with every ounce of strength she had. She tumbled through the other side, landing hard on the floor of her bedroom. The mirror was behind her, its surface solid once more. She scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The room was silent, the oppressive weight gone. The mirror stood innocently against the wall, its surface reflecting nothing but the empty room. Maggie stared at it, her heart still racing. She wanted to believe it had all been a nightmare, but the bruises on her wrists told a different story. She didn't sleep that night, or the next. She covered the mirror with a sheet, but even then, she could feel its presence, like a predator waiting in the shadows. Days turned into weeks, and Maggie tried to convince herself she was safe. But every night, she would wake to the sound of faint scratching, like nails dragging across glass. And every morning, she would find the sheet on the floor, the mirror uncovered, its surface gleaming in the early light. One night, she couldn't take it anymore. She grabbed a hammer and swung it at the mirror, shattering the glass into 1,000 pieces. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the shards scattered across the floor, she heard it, a low, guttural laugh. The pieces began to tremble, then rise, floating in the air as if guided by an unseen force. They swirled around her, cutting into her skin, drawing blood. And then, with a deafening crash, they reformed into the mirror, whole and unbroken. Maggie stared at her reflection, her face pale and drawn. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, in the shadows of the room, stood the doppelganger, its grin wider than ever. It reached out, its hand emerging from the glass once more. Maggie closed her eyes, too exhausted to fight. The last thing she felt was the cold grip of its hand, pulling her back into the mirror. And this time, there was no escape. Maggie's screams were swallowed by the void as the doppelganger dragged her back into the mirror. The world twisted and warped around her, the air thick with the stench of rot and despair. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the distorted version of her apartment. She was in a labyrinth, an endless maze of mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of herself. Some were older, some younger, some twisted and monstrous. All of them were watching her. The doppelganger released her, its grin never fading. "You shouldn't have tried to leave," it hissed, its voice echoing through the maze. "You belong here now." Maggie stumbled backward, her eyes darting from mirror to mirror. Each reflection moved independently, some whispering, some laughing, some screaming. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of voices that made her head spin. She turned and ran, her feet slamming against the cold, glassy floor. The maze seemed to stretch on forever, the mirrors shifting and changing, leading her in circles. She rounded a corner and skidded to a halt. In front of her was a mirror unlike the others. It was larger, its frame carved with intricate, grotesque figures, twisted faces, clawed hands and gaping mouths. The surface of the glass was black, like a pool of ink, and in the center, a faint light flickered like a distant star. Maggie hesitated, but the sound of the doppelganger's laughter behind her spurred her into action. She reached out, her fingers brushing the surface of the mirror. It rippled, and she felt a pull, as if the mirror was drawing her in. She stepped forward, and the world dissolved around her. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her apartment. But something was wrong. The room was too quiet, the air too still. She turned to the mirror, the real mirror, and froze. Her reflection was gone. Instead, the glass showed the maze, the doppelganger standing in the center, its grin wider than ever. "You can't escape," it said, its voice coming from the mirror. "You're mine now." Maggie backed away, her heart pounding. She turned and ran to the door, yanking it open. But the hallway outside was wrong. The walls were covered in mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of herself. Some were crying, some were laughing, some were screaming. The floor was slick with a dark, viscous liquid that clung to her feet as she ran. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew she had to get away. The mirrors seemed to close in around her, the reflections growing more distorted, more monstrous. She could hear the doppelganger's laughter echoing through the hallway, growing louder with every step. Finally, she reached the stairwell. She threw open the door and stumbled down the stairs, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But when she reached the bottom, she realized with a sinking dread that she wasn't in the lobby. She was back in the maze. The doppelganger was waiting for her. "You can't run forever," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "You'll tire eventually, and when you do, I'll be there." Maggie turned and ran again, her mind racing. She had to find a way out, but the maze seemed endless, the mirrors shifting and changing to block her path. She rounded a corner and found herself face to face with the black mirror again. The light in the center flickered, beckoning her. She didn't hesitate this time. She reached out and touched the glass, feeling the pull as it drew her in. The world dissolved, and she was back in her apartment. But the doppelganger was there, waiting for her. "You can't escape," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You're mine now." Maggie backed away, her mind racing. She had to find a way to break the curse, to destroy the mirror once and for all. She grabbed the hammer again and swung it at the mirror, shattering the glass into 1,000 pieces. But as before, the pieces rose into the air, swirling around her like a storm. They cut into her skin, drawing blood, before reforming into the mirror. The doppelganger stepped out of the glass, its grin wider than ever. "You can't destroy me," it said. "I am you." Maggie realized with a sinking dread that it was right. The doppelganger wasn't just a reflection. It was a part of her, a dark, twisted version of herself that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. And now that it had, there was no escape. The doppelganger reached out, its hand cold and clammy against her skin. "You belong here," it said, "with me." Maggie closed her eyes, too exhausted to fight. The last thing she felt was the cold grip of the doppelganger's hand, pulling her back into the mirror. And this time, there was no escape. The mirror stood silently in the apartment, its surface gleaming in the dim light. And in the reflection, Maggie's twisted doppelganger grinned, its eyes gleaming with malice. It had won, and Maggie was gone. Maggie's consciousness flickered like a dying flame as the doppelganger pulled her deeper into the mirror. The labyrinth of reflections stretched endlessly, each mirror a window into a different version of her life. Some real, some imagined, all tainted by the doppelganger's malevolence. She felt herself unraveling, her sense of self dissolving into the void. But just as she was about to succumb completely, something shifted. The doppelganger's grip loosened, and Maggie fell to the cold, glassy floor of the maze. She looked up, her vision blurred, and saw a figure standing in the distance. It wasn't a reflection. It was a man, his face gaunt and pale, his eyes hollow. He wore tattered clothes, and his hands were bound in chains that seemed to melt into the floor. He stared at her, his expression a mix of pity and desperation. "You're not the first," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "and you won't be the last." Maggie struggled to her feet, her body trembling. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I was like you," he said. "I try to destroy the mirror, but it's alive. It feeds on us. It takes pieces of us and leaves us here, trapped in its maze." Maggie's heart sank. "There has to be a way out," she said, though she wasn't sure she believed it. The man shook his head. "The only way out is to replace yourself. Find someone else to take your place, and the mirror will let you go." Maggie recoiled. "I can't do that," she said. "I won't." The man's hollow eyes bore into hers. "You will," he said. "When the hunger sets in, you'll do anything to escape." Before Maggie could respond, the doppelganger appeared behind the man, its grin wider than ever. It reached out, its fingers elongating into claws, and plunged them into the man's chest. He didn't scream. He simply dissolved, his body crumbling into dust that was absorbed by the floor. The doppelganger turned to Maggie, its eyes gleaming with malice. "Your turn," it said. Maggie turned and ran, her mind racing. She couldn't replace herself. She wouldn't. But the man's words echoed in her mind. "The mirror is alive. It feeds on us." She had to find another way. She ran through the maze, the mirrors shifting and changing around her. Some showed her childhood, others showed her future. A future where she was old and alone, her eyes hollow and her soul empty. She tried not to look, but the images burned into her mind. Finally, she reached the black mirror again. The light in the center flickered, beckoning her. She hesitated, but the sound of the doppelganger's laughter behind her spurred her into action. She reached out and touched the glass, feeling the pull as it drew her in. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her apartment. But it wasn't her apartment. Not exactly. The walls were covered in mirrors, each one reflecting a different version of herself. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the floor was slick with a dark, viscous liquid. The doppelganger stepped out of the mirror, its grin wider than ever. "You can't escape," it said. "You're mine now." Maggie backed away, her mind racing. She had to find a way to break the curse, to destroy the mirror once and for all. She grabbed the hammer again and swung it at the mirror, shattering the glass into 1,000 pieces. But as before, the pieces rose into the air, swirling around her like a storm. They cut into her skin, drawing blood, before reforming into the mirror. The doppelganger stepped out of the glass, its grin wider than ever. "You can't destroy me," it said. "I am you." Maggie realized with a sinking dread that it was right. The doppelganger wasn't just a reflection. It was a part of her, a dark, twisted version of herself that had been waiting for the right moment to emerge. And now that it had, there was no escape. The doppelganger reached out, its hand cold and clammy against her skin. "You belong here," it said. "With me." Maggie closed her eyes, too exhausted to fight. The last thing she felt was the cold grip of the doppelganger's hand, pulling her back into the mirror. And this time, there was no escape. The mirror stood silently in the apartment, its surface gleaming in the dim light. And in the reflection, Maggie's twisted doppelganger grinned, its eyes gleaming with malice. It had won, and Maggie was gone. But the mirror wasn't done. It never was. It waited, patient and hungry, for the next tenant to move in. And when they did, it would begin again. The cycle of horror, the endless maze of reflections, the insatiable hunger of the mirror. It would never end. Maggie's consciousness flickered in the void, her essence scattered across the labyrinth of mirrors. She was no longer whole, no longer herself. The doppelganger had consumed her, piece by piece, until only a fragment of her remained. But that fragment refused to die. It clung to the edges of her mind, a spark of defiance in the endless darkness. The doppelganger, now fully in control, stood in the center of the maze, its grin stretching wider than ever. It reveled in its victory, its twisted form shifting and writhing as it absorbed the last remnants of Maggie's soul. But as it did, something unexpected happened. The maze began to tremble. The mirrors cracked, their surfaces splintering like spiderwebs. The air grew heavy, charged with an energy that made the doppelganger's grin falter. It turned, its hollow eyes scanning the labyrinth, searching for the source of the disturbance. And then it saw her, Maggie, but not the Maggie it had consumed. This was a different Maggie, a version of herself she had never known existed. She stood tall, her eyes blazing with a fierce determination. Her form shimmered, as if she were made of light, and the mirrors around her reflected not her image, but the truth of her soul. "You thought you won," she said, her voice echoing through the maze. "But you forgot one thing." The doppelganger snarled, its form twisting and contorting. "What are you?" it hissed. "I'm the part of her you could never touch," Maggie said. "The part that refuses to give up. The part that fights back." The maze shook violently, the mirrors shattering one by one. The doppelganger stumbled, its form flickering as the labyrinth collapsed around it. Maggie stepped forward, her light growing brighter with each step. "You're not me," she said. "You're just a shadow, and shadows can't exist without light." The doppelganger screamed, its form dissolving into darkness as Maggie's light consumed it. The maze crumbled, the mirrors falling into nothingness. And then, with a final, blinding flash, everything went white. Maggie opened her eyes. She was back in her apartment, standing in front of the mirror, but it wasn't the same mirror. The glass was clear, the frame unbroken. The oppressive weight was gone, the air clean and fresh. She reached out, her fingers brushing the surface of the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, whole and unbroken. But something was different. In the reflection, she saw not just herself, but the countless others who had fallen victim to the mirror's curse. Their faces flickered in the background, their eyes filled with gratitude. They were free now, their souls released from the mirror's grip. Maggie stepped back, her heart pounding. She had done it. She had broken the curse. But as she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of something in the corner of the mirror. A shadow, faint but unmistakable. It was the doppelganger, its grin twisted into a snarl. "This isn't over," it whispered, its voice barely audible. Maggie froze, her blood running cold. She turned back to the mirror, but the shadow was gone. The glass was clear, her reflection staring back at her with wide eyes. She didn't know if the doppelganger was truly gone, or if it was just biding its time, waiting for the right moment to strike again. But she knew one thing for certain. The mirror was no longer just a mirror. It was a warning, a reminder of the darkness that lurked within us all. And as long as it existed, the cycle of horror would never truly end. Maggie covered the mirror with a sheet, her hands trembling. She would never look into it again. But deep down, she knew it didn't matter. The mirror had already taken a piece of her, and it would always be there, waiting, watching, hungry for more. The end. Thank you all for watching. Please like and subscribe for more scary stories.